Night arrived along the shore in a slow, even way, as if a dim veil were being drawn across the horizon. The tide had just turned, leaving a broad band of damp sand that reflected a faint scatter of stars. Farther up the beach, pale dunes rose like quiet shoulders, their grasses barely moving. A narrow path of weathered boards led down between the dunes, ending at a simple post where a lantern once hung. The post remained, smooth from seasons of salt air, and a small metal hook still curved outward. Beyond the post, the beach widened. Here and there, driftwood lay in long, silvered pieces, bleached by sun in other seasons, now cooled to the color of moonlight. In the distance, a buoy light blinked once, then vanished behind a low line of mist. The sea spoke in a steady, soft rush, and the sand shifted from tan to slate under the night. As the moon climbed, a shape resolved on a slightly higher rise of beach, beyond the reach of the last wave line. It was a sand castle, placed carefully, its walls neat and rounded, its towers standing in a calm ring. Each tower matched the next in height, each top pressed flat with a clean edge. A shallow moat circled the castle like a penciled line, dark with dampness, then bright where the moon caught its rim. The castle did not look freshly made, yet it was not worn down either. It held a steady form, as if the grains had agreed to stay where they were. Along the outer wall, small shells had been pressed into the sand at even intervals, pale commas in a long sentence. At the main gateway, 2 slightly larger shells marked the entrance, one on each side, like quiet posts. Nothing moved around the castle except the slow travel of mist and the faint sparkle of mica in the sand. A little farther down the shore, where the beach curved toward a cluster of rocks, moonlight pooled in long ribbons. The rocks were slick and black, banded with pale seams, and in their crevices tiny tide pools captured fragments of the sky. Each pool held a miniature reflection, a small star, a small moon, a slow ripple that smoothed itself. As the sea rose, the pools refreshed, trading out old water for new, then settling again. Near the rocks, the sound of waves changed into a soft percussion of water meeting stone, then sliding away. The beach sand here was coarser, scattered with tiny pebbles that clicked faintly when the water rolled them. A narrow channel between 2 rocks guided a thin stream of seawater back to the ocean, drawing a silver line through the darkness. Farther up the beach, beyond the reach of splashes, the castle remained in clear view, holding its place on the open sand. The castle's details became clearer in stages, as if the night itself were inspecting it. A low outer wall wrapped around the mound, forming a boundary with small notches like steps. Behind the wall, inner courtyards dipped and rose, making gentle basins. The towers were rounded cylinders, their sides marked with shallow grooves, evenly spaced, as if pressed by the ridged edge of a shell. Between 2 towers, the gateway opened into shadow. It was not a tunnel, only a short passage, yet its interior looked deeper because the walls rose close on either side. On the crest of the largest tower, a small crown of pebbles formed a ring, each pebble selected for its smoothness. The pebbles differed in color, gray, charcoal, ivory, but matched in size. Near the moat, a thin line of darker sand traced an oval, as if a careful finger had once drawn a second boundary outside the first. A tiny feather lay nearby, white and narrow, pointing toward the sea. Along the dunes, a small wooden sign stood half buried, its paint faded to a pale gray. The words were long gone, leaving only the suggestion that a message once existed there. Near the sign, beach roses grew in a tangle, their leaves dark and glossy in the moonlight. One blossom remained, closed for the night, and a bead of dew sat on its outer petal. The dew caught the moon and held it as a tiny lens. Behind the dunes, the silhouettes of pines rose in layered rows, their trunks invisible, their crowns forming soft sawtooth edges against the sky. No lights came from beyond the dunes. The land stayed in shadow. A thin strand of dune grass bent and straightened with the breeze, repeating the same small motion again and again. Down on the open sand, the castle's rounded towers made a small skyline of their own. The beach offered other small arrangements, each quieter than the last. A crescent of smooth stones lay near the water, collected by the tide's habit of sorting and placing. A shallow basin in the sand held a thin film of water that reflected the castle upside down, making a second, softer fortress that trembled whenever the sea sent a faint vibration through the ground. Nearby, a piece of sea glass lay half buried, green and matte, catching just one thin line of light. Farther up, small ridges of sand ran parallel to the shore, left by wind, each ridge repeating the next at even spacing like lines on a page. A strip of kelp lay curled near one ridge, its edges folded like ribbon, and when the breeze touched it, it shifted with a faint rustle. The castle stood among these simple objects without claiming more attention than any of them. The moat remained a quiet circle, and the outer wall held its steady curve. If the castle had a map, it would have been a map of small spaces. The outer wall held a narrow walkway, barely wide enough for a thin line of shadow. Inside, the courtyards formed gentle terraces, with shallow steps leading from one level to the next. At the center, a circular platform rose slightly, smooth and flat, like a tiny plaza. On the plaza, a pattern of dots had been pressed into the sand, forming a ring inside a ring. Each dot was the size of a raindrop, perfectly placed, and between the rings a spiral line connected them, as if someone had traced a slow path. Near one corner of the inner courtyard, 3 shells were set in a triangle: a pale scallop, a striped cockle, and a small spiral whelk. Between them, grains of mica caught light and flashed briefly, then went dull again as the angle shifted. Near one corner of the inner courtyard, 3 shells were set in a triangle: a pale scallop, a striped cockle, and a small spiral whelk. Between them, grains of mica caught light and flashed briefly, then went dull again as the angle shifted. The mica appeared and disappeared, appearing and disappeared, like a small signal that required no reply. Along the outer wall, the grooves on the towers repeated with calm regularity, each groove matching the next, each tower matching the next, so the whole structure seemed assembled from gentle repetitions. The tide pools near the rocks continued their quiet work of reflecting. One pool held a shell cup, half submerged, and inside that shell cup a tiny bubble clung to the inner curve. The bubble remained perfectly round, holding a minuscule reflection of the moon. In another pool, a strand of sea lettuce drifted slowly in circles, guided by the pool's gentle current. The pool's edges were lined with barnacles that looked like clustered porcelain. As the tide rose, water slid into the crevices, then retreated, leaving the pools to settle again. Each settling smoothed the surface until it became a dark mirror. Then a ripple crossed and the mirror turned to moving glass. A small crab shell, empty and pale, rested under a rock ledge, its legs arranged as if still. Nothing disturbed it. The sea's movement passed around it, then away. Back on the open sand, the castle's moat held its dark ring, and the shells along the wall kept their pale, steady highlights. Mist moved in slow layers across the shore, sometimes thinning until the stars appeared more sharply, sometimes thickening so the horizon blurred. When the horizon blurred, sea and sky became one dark band, and the buoy light vanished entirely. The castle did not disappear, but its edges softened, as if drawn with a gentler pencil. The shells still caught light, though less brightly, and the moat's line became a faint ring. Then the mist loosened again, and details returned. The pebbled crown on the tallest tower, the tiny feather near the outer boundary, the dotted rings on the central platform. The reflective basin near the castle held the upside-down fortress a moment longer, then drained slowly as the sand absorbed its thin water. When the basin drained, the reflection faded into a dark patch that matched the rest of the beach. The stone crescent near the water remained in place, each stone glistening briefly when a wave reached it. The sea's edge traced curves that looked like drawn lines, erased, then drawn again, always in slightly different arcs. The sea, patient and repetitive, continued to rise. The water line crept closer to the moat, paused at the outer edge, then eased back, leaving a thin foam line that dissolved into shining grains. The water made no attempt to enter the moat. It simply approached, paused, withdrew, and approached again, in a rhythm as even as a pendulum. A small wave reached a little farther than the last, then retreated, leaving a darker curve on the sand that slowly lightened. The stone crescent near the water glistened, then dulled, then glistened again, depending on the wave's reach. Along the curve of the beach, the rocks became half hidden in mist, then half revealed again, their tide pools flashing faintly with reflected moon. Near the castle's gateway, one shell at the entrance tilted slightly, and its shadow shifted by a finger's width, then held steady. The castle remained unchanged, and the night offered the same small motions, approach and retreat, reveal and soften, shimmer and fade. Time moved in the simplest way, waves repeating, mist drifting, moon climbing. The beach offered variations on the same scene rather than sudden changes. The waterline approached, stopped, and eased away. The mist passed over the castle, softened its edges, then cleared. The moon's light shifted so the tower's shadows moved slightly around their bases, then settled. At the gateway, a tiny shell fragment lay like a pale wedge. It had been there all along, but now its angle caught light, and the fragment looked like a small, bright mark at the threshold. On the central platform, the ring of dots remained crisp. The spiral line connecting them remained visible, then less visible when a strand of mist drifted across, then visible again. A thin stream of water far down by the rocks traced a silver line through a channel and then disappeared into the sea. On the open sand, the feather near the outer boundary stayed pointing toward the ocean, and the driftwood pieces farther up the beach lay in long, quiet shapes. Nothing announced itself. Everything simply stayed, shifted, and stayed again. The night deepened into a smoother shade. Fewer stars were visible through the mist, yet the moon remained steady above the blurred horizon. The tide reached a gentle high point and rested there, its forward edge flattening, then becoming less eager to travel farther. Foam lines grew thinner. Near the moat, water approached once more, stopped at the boundary, and lingered for a quiet moment, then withdrew. When the water withdrew, it left behind a thin sheen on the sand that reflected the castle's towers as faint smudges of light. After a while, the tide began to ease back. The mist followed it in loose layers, drifting outward and thinning. The rocks near the curve of the shore emerged more clearly, still slick, still dark, with tide pools smoothing their surfaces again. The stone crescent near the water settled into its place, and the scattered sea glass kept its single line of light. The castle remained where it stood, rounded towers, shadowed gateway, intact moat, shells pressed into its walls, dotted rings on its central plaza. The beach continued in its slow repetitions as the sea drew its line a little farther away, and the castle stayed on the higher sand, quietly present beneath the moon. Inside the gateway, the shadow held a different texture than the open sand. The passage floor was smooth, as if pressed by a flat board, and the sides rose with the same rounded care as the outer wall. Just beyond the passage, a small courtyard opened, slightly lower than the gateway threshold. In its center lay a shallow depression shaped like an oval dish, and within it, a thin layer of darker grains formed a patch that looked almost velvety. A few white shell chips were set around the patch in a neat curve, like a small constellation arranged by hand. Near the courtyard edge, a narrow groove ran along the base of the wall, collecting a line of dampness. Here and there, tiny rivulets had traced their own paths, then stopped, leaving delicate branching marks that resembled miniature river deltas. At one corner, a staircase of 3 small steps rose back toward the outer wall, each step compacted and clean, each edge softly rounded. The castle's surfaces held the moonlight in different ways. Dry sand appeared pale and matte, while damp sand looked darker, almost polished. Along the moat, the damp rim reflected a thin crescent of light that shifted as the mist drifted. On the towers, the grooves made alternating bands of brightness and shadow, turning each cylinder into a simple pattern. The shell commas along the wall caught highlights one by one, then lost them, then caught them again, depending on the angle of the moon. Even the pebbled crown on the tallest tower changed from distinct stones to a single dark ring when the mist thickened, then back again when the air cleared. Out beyond the castle, the sea continued its measured movement, drawing a line, erasing it, drawing another line. The beach remained a quiet stage of repeating shapes, dunes in the distance, stones by the water, rocks at the curve, and centered on the higher sand, the quiet sand castle, steady in its details and steady in its silence.